In 1985, my mother kissed my forehead, told me we'd stop at the store after her shift, and walked out the door. She always came home by 4:30. That day, she didn't. And by the time the sun set, our living room felt too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. 3 days later, they found her patrol car abandoned behind a warehouse. But no one found her. Not then. Not for a very long time. And by the time they did, we weren't the same family anymore. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and tap like if you believe no one should vanish without answers. Stories like this need to be heard. My name's Carla Jameson. I was 8 years old in 1985, living with my mom in a small apartment on the south side of town. She was a patrol officer, Officer Patricia Jameson, and she took that badge seriously. Not just because it was her job, but because it meant something. She was the kind of woman who made pancakes on school mornings and checked on elderly neighbors on her way to work. We didn't have much. Just a 2-bedroom with laminate floors, a dented fridge, and a calendar on the wall with every shift marked in red. But it was home. It was safe. My mom made sure of that. She'd start the day with instant coffee toast and one eye on the news. She'd brush her hair back into a tight ponytail clip on her duty belt and smile at me like she wasn't exhausted. Some mornings, she'd rehearse traffic stop procedures with me just for practice. "What do you do if the driver's agitated?" She'd ask, half distracted, pouring cereal. Most afternoons, she'd be back by 4. She'd unclip the badge, kick off her boots, and sit beside me while I worked through spelling words. I remember the smell of her leather peppermints, the faint trace of engine oil from her patrol car. That fall, we were working on a school project together, something with shoeboxes and tissue paper, a model of the solar system. She'd promised we'd pick up glue sticks after her shift that Tuesday. It was a normal day. A regular day. Until it wasn't. That morning, nothing seemed off. She got dressed, packed my lunch, made sure I had my mittens. She hugged me a little longer than usual, maybe. But no big speech, no warning. She just smiled and said, "See you after school, baby. We've got planets to build." I watched her car pull out from the window, not knowing that was the last time I'd see her face. That evening, 4:30 came and went. Then 5, then 6. By the time Grandma Ruth picked up the phone, I was already at the window waiting, watching, telling myself maybe her radio died. Maybe she'd had to work late. But the street outside our apartment stayed empty. That was the night I first learned that silence can be a warning. Not everything that disappears makes a sound when it leaves. Grandma Ruth called the station around 6:30 that evening. I remember her pacing one hand on her hip, the other gripping our rotary phone like she could squeeze answers out of it. She didn't say much when she hung up, just that they hadn't seen my mom since her last shift ended. The way she looked at the door after that, like she expected it to swing open any second, stuck with me. We both sat up that whole night. No TV, no radio, just silence and the ticking kitchen clock. By morning, when the sun came in, soft and gray through the blinds, Grandma picked up the phone again. This time, she filed the report herself. Officially, Officer Patricia Jameson was missing. At first, it felt like things were happening. Calls went out to hospitals. Grandma drove across town, checking the ERs, talking to nurses, even asking gas station clerks if they'd seen a cruiser parked nearby. My mom's friend from church, Miss Layla, came by and helped make flyers, black and white copies with her badge photo, and the words, "Missing Police Officer," printed bold underneath. Neighbors chipped in for a small reward. A few brought over casserole dishes and stayed to help answer the phone. But as the hours passed and the first day slipped into the second, it became clear the response we were expecting wasn't coming. My mom's partner, Officer Day, told Grandma that she'd clocked out like usual. Nothing seemed off. No disciplinary action, no out-of-policy behavior, no stress leave filed. He said she'd answered a minor disturbance call around 3:45 p.m. on the south side, and that was the last anyone heard from her. That area wasn't far from where we lived, just a few miles places she'd patrolled for months. She knew every alley, every fence line, every face on those blocks. If something had happened out there, she would have known how to handle it. That's what made it so strange. No radio traffic after that last call, no check-in, just silence. By the third day, volunteers were walking the neighborhoods. Church groups, off-duty officers, even strangers who'd heard about it on the radio. Some folks brought their dogs. Others printed their own maps and started tracking sightings, tips, rumors, anything. I heard one man tell Grandma he thought he'd seen her at a grocery store near Route 18, but it turned out to be a different woman in uniform. The local AM station ran her photo during the weather breaks and played clips of her voice from a training seminar she'd given the year before. Hearing her voice float out from that little clock radio in our kitchen made my throat close up. It sounded so normal, like she was still just out there. Then came the patrol car. It was found on a Friday afternoon parked behind a long-abandoned warehouse near the freight line. The building had broken windows, grass growing through the concrete lot. Kids used to ride their bikes back there. The cruiser was locked, keys gone. Her radio was shut off, which was strange in itself. She always kept it on until the last second of her shift. Inside, the driver's seat had been pushed back too far, like someone taller had driven it. Her flashlight was tossed in the back seat, not clipped to the console. Her purse was there, but the wallet was missing. Citation book half torn. Pages gone from her log. Grandma and I weren't allowed near the scene, but one of the younger officers, we called him Danny, pulled Grandma aside later that evening and told her quietly that they'd found unidentified fingerprints on the inside door handle. That Patricia's sidearm was missing. That the odometer showed more miles than it should have if she'd stuck to her regular beat. He looked pale when he said it, like he knew what all that meant but didn't want to be the one to say it aloud. The department issued a statement that night. Short. Dry. Officer Patricia Jameson is considered missing under concerning circumstances. Investigation ongoing. No press conference. No police union appearance. No blue ribbons tied to antennas. And no federal involvement, which shocked Grandma. She'd expected the FBI. But the days kept ticking past and the silence got louder. One by one, the reporters stopped calling. The reward fund stopped growing. Officers stopped showing up at our door. I think that was the part that hurt Grandma the most. Not the strangers, but the ones in uniform who'd worked beside her daughter and suddenly had nothing to say. Some stopped returning her calls altogether. Others gave short, rehearsed answers about policy and protocol. But no one came to sit in the kitchen with us. No one put up extra flyers or organized a vigil. That kind of effort came from neighbors, church friends, and folks who didn't even know her. The people she'd worn that badge for. A week after the car was found, Miss Layla drove me to school in silence while Grandma met with the lieutenant. I sat in the back seat watching sidewalks go by, trying to count mailboxes or hydrants, anything to distract from the way adults kept whispering when they thought I couldn't hear. When I got home that afternoon, Grandma was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded tight in her lap. I asked her what they'd said. She looked up real slow and told me they thought maybe my mom had needed to step away from her responsibilities, that sometimes officers burned out, that single mothers occasionally made unexpected choices. I remember feeling confused at first. Then I felt angry. Not because I understood all the implications, but because even at 8 years old I knew my mom wouldn't leave me waiting at the window on purpose. Not for glue sticks, not for anything. Grandma must have felt it too, because the next morning she was already making calls. She hired a man named Mr. Weller, a private investigator who used to be with the sheriff's department in Jefferson County. He looked over the patrol logs, asked about friends, combed through her notebooks and receipts. He told us the search should have expanded far beyond city limits within the first 48 hours, that officers' homes and lockers should have been checked. But none of that had happened. It was already too late to recreate those steps. That Sunday, the church held a candlelight vigil in the parking lot. People passed around paper cups with wax stubs holding them close against the wind. I saw my mother's picture projected on the side of the building, white uniform shirt, quiet smile. Someone sang "Abide with Me," and someone else I don't know who placed a single handcuff on the folding table next to her badge. I remember thinking it looked wrong there, out of place, like it had been left behind by mistake. And yet, even then, nobody said the word we were all thinking. They said missing. They said unexplained. But they didn't say what was starting to feel heavier by the day. Then one night, maybe a week or so later, the phone rang just past midnight. Grandma was already awake. She never slept much after all this started. She answered, and I watched from the hallway. I couldn't hear the voice on the other end, but I saw the way she straightened in her chair, the way her mouth pressed into a hard line. She stayed quiet a long time, just listening, then hung up without a word. When I asked who it was, she said, "Wrong number." But the way her hands shook told me it wasn't. Grandma never talked about that call again. Whatever was said on the other end, she locked it up tight the way she did with bad news. But after that night, I noticed she kept the curtains drawn even during the day. She unplugged the living room phone and moved a small baseball bat beside the front door. She never told me I should be afraid, but she didn't need to. I could feel it in the way she walked slower, more careful, like the ground itself had turned uncertain. A few days later, she went back to the station with Mr. Weller, the private investigator, to request updates. They were told the case was still active but under-resourced. The detective assigned, Detective Harmon, was polite but distant. He had a stack of files on his desk and told Grandma, with the kind of tone you use when you're saying no without saying it, that Patricia's case hadn't turned up any new leads. When she asked whether the FBI had been called, he hesitated, said it was being considered. She asked about the fingerprints found in the patrol car, and he said the lab hadn't matched them to anyone in the database yet. When she asked why they hadn't released a composite sketch or made a public plea for help, he just nodded and said, "We're still looking into that." But the way he closed the file when she stood up told her everything, Mr. Weller was more direct once they got outside. He told Grandma the truth she already suspected, that if my mom had gone missing in uniform under different circumstances, the response would have looked very different. That when an officer disappears, especially a woman who's been on shift protocol, usually means mobilizing every available resource. News conferences, search dogs, federal consultation. But none of that had happened for Patricia. And the deeper he looked, the more it seemed like something or someone was keeping the search from gaining traction. Grandma didn't say anything on the way home. She sat in the front seat with her hands in her lap and stared out the window like she was memorizing the shape of the town. We kept running our own search. Miss Layla and Mr. Weller organized community flyers while church friends checked old buildings and rural roads outside the city. A local print shop gave us a deal on the posters, and a bus driver offered to hang one near the downtown depot. But the city felt like it was moving on one quiet day at a time. Even at school, the teachers stopped asking how I was doing. My mom's name started to fade from the news, replaced by other stories: political scandals, a warehouse fire, a missing boy in another state. Life kept going, just not for us. And then came the first real shift. Mr. Weller stopped by one evening with a copy of the original case log. He'd gotten it through a contact in the department, someone who didn't want their name mentioned. He sat with Grandma at the kitchen table, flipping through the pages while I colored on the floor. He pointed out something odd. Patricia's log ended at 3:45 p.m., which we already knew, but the call she responded to the minor disturbance wasn't documented properly. No address, no follow-up. Just a line entry with a time and a vague code. Normally, every call would be noted in more detail. Weller said it looked like someone had gone back and trimmed the log, made it look routine. Too clean, like it was hiding something. That was the first time I heard Grandma curse under her breath. She poured herself a drink that night, something she almost never did, and sat out on the stoop for a long time, wrapped in her sweater, even though it wasn't cold. Mr. Weller kept digging. He visited the warehouse where the car had been found, took photos, checked for nearby cameras, even tracked down a retired dock worker who remembered seeing a cruiser parked back there a few times before Patricia disappeared. When asked if he'd ever seen who was in the car, the man just shook his head. Never close enough to tell, he said, but it always felt like it wasn't supposed to be there. That detail stuck with me for years. About a month after the disappearance, Grandma went to a public forum at City Hall. They were holding a meeting about budget cuts, but she stood up and asked why there hadn't been a press briefing about Patricia, why the department hadn't held a community update or issued an appeal for tips. The mayor deferred to the chief of police, who said they were doing everything they could, but no one offered specifics, no dates, no next steps, just vague reassurances and the sound of papers shuffling. A reporter from the Clarion Times was there. He spoke to Grandma afterward and asked for an interview. She agreed, but only if they told the story without changing the facts. That article ran 2 days later, tucked halfway through the B section. It showed my mom's academy photo and used the word "vanished" in the headline. A few more calls came in after that, people who thought they'd seen something or heard something, but nothing stuck. And then, like everything else, the article faded. At home, the house changed. Grandma removed my mom's uniform from the hallway closet and folded it into a box. She packed up the framed photos from her graduation and tucked them into the linen chest. Not because she was giving up, she wasn't, but because something about the silence made those things feel too loud. I started sleeping in her bed some nights. I'd wake up with the blanket wrapped too tight around my legs, and the distant sound of Grandma downstairs clicking through radio stations or sitting by the phone waiting for a call that wouldn't come. I remember one afternoon clearly. It was cold with a kind of damp gray sky that never fully lifted. We were in line at the grocery store, and a woman behind us leaned down and asked if I was Patricia's daughter. I nodded. She smiled a little, then whispered, "I'm praying for y'all." That's when I realized people had stopped asking if my mom would come home. They were just hoping we'd survive not knowing. We had visitors, sometimes other officers, a few community members, but no one from the union, no formal update from the department. And when Grandma called for information, she was told the file was still active, but there were no new developments. That phrase, "no new developments," became a kind of wall. You couldn't climb over it, couldn't go around it. It just stood there between us and the truth. Mr. Weller kept trying, but he started to sound tired. He said people weren't talking, that doors were getting harder to open, that the more he looked, the more it felt like someone didn't want him looking at all. Then one morning, weeks later, Grandma received a letter. No return address, no name inside. Just a typed message on plain white paper folded twice. It read, "Let it go, for your own good." She didn't tell me about it at the time. I found out years later when I was old enough to understand what it meant. But I do remember the look in her eyes that day, like something had reached through the walls and reminded her we weren't as alone as we thought. She didn't call the police. She didn't tell the neighbors. She just took the note, slid it into an envelope, and filed it away in the drawer beneath the sink. By Christmas, we'd stopped expecting the doorbell. No car in the driveway, no knock from the sheriff. Just the same unanswered questions lined up like wrapped gifts no one would open. But something else arrived that winter. Something small, and almost easy to miss if you weren't looking close enough. A church bulletin, a torn corner, a scribbled note in handwriting Grandma didn't recognize. It said, "Check her reports from October. Start with the traffic stop near 5th and Gilroy." And nothing else. Grandma didn't say anything when she read the note. She unfolded it 3 times, held it under the kitchen light, then slid it into the same envelope that held the first warning. I watched her do it standing there in her robe with the heater running and the smell of burnt toast in the air. She didn't explain where it came from, just looked at Mr. Weller and said, "I think we need to go back further than we have." That afternoon, he pulled the October logs from his file drawer. He'd been keeping his own copies since the department hadn't exactly been generous with access. They were full of gaps, but he still had a handful of calls from late in the month, some routine, some flagged for later. He circled the traffic stop near 5th and Gilroy. October 19th, mid-afternoon. No follow-up, no incident report. Just a unit code and a street name. That was where we started. Mr. Weller drove out there the next morning. I remember because it rained steady, cold rain that made the gutters overflow and the streets slick with leaves. He walked the block, knocked on a few doors, asked questions in that quiet way he had. Most people didn't remember anything. Too long ago, too many shifts and seasons since. But one woman, an older tenant in a ground floor unit, said she remembered a patrol car parked at the curb that day. She remembered because her dog had been barking at it for nearly 10 minutes. She never saw who was inside, just the white door with the blue stripe, and the fact that it stayed parked long after she expected it to move on. Didn't seem like a ticket stop, she said. Seemed like they were talking. She didn't know who they was, though. Just a guess from the way the car sat there idling. Mr. Weller came back wet and thoughtful. He said it wasn't much, but it was something. A conversation that wasn't logged. A vehicle left longer than it should have been. And it was a street just outside Mom's regular beat. Not unheard of, but not typical. He started digging again quietly. He didn't tell the department. Didn't want to tip anything off. He focused on arrests and reports from that week, especially ones that looked incomplete. And that's when he noticed a name that showed up twice, Jerome Tate. Picked up on possession, but never charged. Both times the reports were missing signatures. The arresting officer on the second one, Patricia Jameson, but her name had been crossed out and replaced with someone else's handwriting. The file had been reprinted, refiled, and redated. Sloppy, but intentional. That night, Grandma called the department and asked to speak with the detective again. She was told Harmon had been reassigned and that any questions should go through a general tip line. No one offered a replacement contact. No one followed up. We didn't know it then, but we'd reached the point where the file was being quietly moved to cold status. Officially still open, unofficially shelved. By winter, the calls slowed. Mr. Weller came by less often, not because he'd given up, but because we had nothing new to go on. The case hadn't gone public beyond the initial news cycle. The city was busy with a mayoral shakeup, a fire at the rail yard, and a string of burglaries that kept the headlines full. Even the people who'd once knocked on our door with covered dishes and warm promises started showing up less. That's not a judgment, just the way the world turns. Pain isn't contagious, but people treat it like it is. Grandma started writing letters. She mailed one every Monday to the chief's office, another to the city council, and a third to the local paper. They were never angry, just clear. She listed facts, dates, questions that hadn't been answered. Most of them were ignored, but sometimes we'd get a short reply, a thank you for your concern, or a this matter remains under review. After a while, she stopped expecting anything back. The act of mailing them became the point. Around that time, I began to notice little things in our house shifting. Grandma moved my mother's badge from the hallway into her bedroom. She put a new lock on the back door, even though no one had used it in years. She taped over the peephole. She didn't say she was scared. She didn't need to. Fear has a scent, and it lingered in our hallway like smoke. The worst were the days when the mail didn't come at all. We'd wait and watch, and when nothing showed up, we'd just sit with the quiet. I remember one afternoon in particular, mid-January, just before sunset. I found Grandma at the table with the envelope again, reading the typewritten note for the 4th or 5th time. She traced the words with her finger, then pulled out a separate slip, this one handwritten. I'd never seen it before. A short list written in my mother's handwriting. 3 names, 2 dates. A phrase evidence logged but not photographed. I asked where it came from. She said it had been in the pocket of one of Patricia's old uniform jackets. Folded small and forgotten. Until now. She handed it to Mr. Weller, and he stared at it like it was a road map. One of the names matched a report he'd flagged back in November, an officer named Finch. Not someone Grandma knew well. He'd worked narcotics in the late 70s, moved to internal transport in '84, supposedly retired. But when Mr. Weller called to confirm the department said Finch had left suddenly just a few weeks after my mom disappeared. No exit interview, no public send-off, just gone. That's when the picture started to shift. Patricia hadn't just vanished. She'd vanished after stepping into something she hadn't meant to find. Mr. Weller laid out the timeline across our dining table. Arrests that disappeared, evidence that never made it to court, reports that were rewritten or misfiled. The deeper he went, the more it became clear that it wasn't incompetence, it was erasure. Someone had been cleaning up, and they'd started before she disappeared, not after. Grandma started sleeping with the hall light on. We kept the living room curtains closed even during the day. The mail kept coming, but now it was being opened outside on the porch. Just in case. Mr. Weller said we needed to be careful who we talked to. Not paranoid, just cautious. He used that word a lot. Cautious. It sounded better than scared. I didn't understand all of it at the time. I was just a kid watching adults go quiet in new ways. But I knew the air in our house had changed. It didn't feel like waiting anymore. It felt like hiding. And then one cold morning, near the end of February, Mr. Weller stopped by earlier than usual. He had a manila envelope under his arm and a look that didn't match the hour. He said he'd found something in the property records, a connection between a vacant lot near the industrial park and one of the names on my mother's list. And then he said the deed was signed by a patrol sergeant, same one who logged her final call. The name on the deed was Sergeant Alan Brewster. That hit harder than I expected. My mom had mentioned him a few times back when things were still normal. She didn't say much, just that he was strict, kept to himself, didn't like patrol officers asking too many questions about evidence handling. He wasn't someone we ever saw outside of uniform, and now here he was tied to a property tucked behind a chain-link fence near the old concrete plant land that wasn't marked residential, wasn't active industrial either. Just a forgotten square of gravel and scrub brush bordered by overgrown grass and the rusted skeletons of loading docks that hadn't seen freight in years. Mr. Weller drove out there first. He took photos through the fence, circled the block twice. No mailbox, no signage, no visible address on the building. Just a chain lock on the front gate and a no trespassing sign so faded you could barely read it. He didn't go inside. He knew better. But he took down every detail surrounding property's utility access points, even the name of the company listed on a partially peeled permit taped to the side door, Calhoun Materials and Transport, LLC. He looked it up that night. The company had dissolved 3 years earlier. No website, no working number. Registered agent Sergeant Brewster's brother-in-law. That shifted things. Up until that point, we'd assumed my mother had uncovered something in the field corruption that ran through the lower ranks, maybe a few bad arrests or missing funds. But this was different. This was property. Records. A trail someone had tried to erase but hadn't erased fully enough. Mr. Weller filed a request with the county clerk to see what had been stored on the lot back when it was active. He cross-referenced that with traffic logs from late 1985 and found something odd: multiple patrol cars logged in that area for reasons that didn't make sense. No reported calls, no arrests, just unit pings, and one of them 2 weeks before my mother vanished was hers. Grandma didn't say much when he told her, just stood in the kitchen holding the edge of the counter. Then she walked over to the drawer by the sink, pulled out the small brown envelope where she'd been keeping the handwritten note we'd found in Mom's jacket pocket, and unfolded it slowly. "Check the names again," she said. "All of them." The last name on that list was Finch. The middle one was someone we didn't know yet. But the first, it was Brewster. We tried going to the department with the deed. Mr. Weller made the call, not Grandma. He asked to speak to whoever had taken over after Detective Harmon. They transferred him to a general line. He left a message. No one called back. He left another the next day. Still nothing. So he walked it in himself, waited in the lobby for 2 hours, and finally handed it to the duty officer at the front desk with a typed summary of what he'd found. The man didn't even read it. Just said it would be passed along. That was the last we heard from them. That weekend our mailbox was left open. Not broken, not pried, just open. Sitting there like a warning that didn't need words. Inside was one of the flyers we'd printed back in December. My mom's face, black and white eyes just off-center from the camera. Across it, in red ink, someone had written, "Drop it." Nothing else. We didn't call the police. By then we knew how that would go. Mr. Weller doubled down. He started mapping connections who had worked what shifts, which supervisors had signed off on what paperwork. He built out a network not of criminals, but of patterns. Officers who never got reassigned, who never showed up in court, but always signed transport logs. A list of names that began to repeat: Brewster, Finch. A third name, Wallace, from the narcotics unit, bounced around divisions until 1986, then took early retirement and left the state. Weller flagged 2 more names tied to that lot. Neither of them were still with the department. One had died in a hunting accident. The other had gone off-grid, last known address in Arizona. We couldn't prove anything yet. We just had paper deeds, shift logs, company filings, scribbled notes in margins. But the weight of it was starting to tip. My mother had seen something. That much was clear. And she hadn't let it go. She was circling something quietly, methodically. The arrest she made in October, the one where the dealer had tried to name-drop police connections, that may have been the thread she pulled. Maybe she'd followed up on her own. Maybe she filed a report that never made it past her supervisor's desk. We'll never know for sure. But that week, Mr. Weller found something that made everything else click. He'd gone back to the warehouse where my mom's patrol car was found. It had been months and the lot was fenced up, but the building still stood. He walked the perimeter, checked for cameras. There were none. But behind the building, just off the alley, he spotted a storm drain cover that had been dislodged. Not recent. Old, rusted. He got a flashlight from his car and looked inside. What he saw made him stop cold. The tunnel wasn't deep, but it ran beneath the foundation of the warehouse. No lights, no recent activity, just an empty crawl space barely tall enough to move through. But on the concrete lip just past the entrance, he saw something wedged into the corner, a torn piece of uniform fabric, navy blue, a corner patch that might have once had a department logo too faded now to tell. He didn't touch it. Just took a photo, then called Grandma. We didn't tell anyone else. Not yet. There was too much we didn't know, and no one left we trusted to bring it to. Mr. Weller submitted the photo to a private lab out of state, paid for the analysis himself. We waited nearly 2 weeks for the results. When they came, the message was brief, cotton poly blend, consistent with municipal issue uniform jackets from the early to mid-'80s. Possible fiber match to standard department wear. No blood, no DNA, no conclusive link. But it was something. Something that shouldn't have been there. That was the moment Grandma said it out loud for the first time. Not in anger, not in grief. Just in a quiet voice barely above a whisper while we sat in the living room with the lights off. They didn't just lose her, she said. They hid her. I didn't ask who they was. I already knew. Mr. Weller said there was still one angle we hadn't touched. He'd heard from a retired dispatcher who was willing to meet. A woman who'd worked midnights back in '85 who said something about that last call my mom made the minor disturbance at 3:45 never sat right with her. The call wasn't logged properly. The dispatch tape had been shortened, trimmed down to remove the full exchange. She said she remembered my mother's voice on that tape sounding calm at first, then clipped, cut off. We were going to meet her the following week, but the night before the meeting, someone broke into Mr. Weller's car. Nothing was stolen. Not the documents, not the files. Just the glove compartment opened, rifled through, and left ajar. They hadn't taken anything. They just wanted us to know. They'd been there. The retired dispatcher's name was Carol Hensley. She'd worked nights from 1976 until early '86, almost a decade, in the chair at the console logging units and fielding everything from drunk calls to domestic standoffs. Mr. Weller had reached her through a contact in a nearby county after a name from his call log match turned up in a background check. Carol was reluctant at first, said she didn't want to get into something old, but agreed to meet at a public library a few towns over. Neutral ground. Quiet. No cameras. It was a cold Tuesday morning, the kind where breath hangs in the air a little longer than it should. She was already there when we walked in, sitting in a corner chair by the genealogy desk with a notebook in her lap. Hair pulled back, big glasses, coat zipped to the collar. She didn't look scared, just like someone who'd made peace with something a long time ago but hadn't quite forgotten it. She told us she remembered the shift, not because anything big happened, but because of what didn't. She said she'd logged Patricia's unit heading to a minor code complaint around 3:45 p.m., and she remembered it clearly because the call came through from a direct line, not 911. No recording. No dispatcher patch-in. The request had already been assigned when it landed in front of her. That was rare. Almost never happened without a supervisor's sign-off. And when she double-checked, the call had been routed through Sergeant Brewster's desk, the same name on the property records. Carol paused after that and looked down at her hands. Said she tried to pull the audio from the shift later that night just out of habit, but the recording file was marked, reviewed, and locked out. When she asked her supervisor the next day, he told her not to worry about it. Chain of command, he'd said, leave it be. A few weeks later, the tape had been pulled entirely. She never saw it again. Mr. Weller asked if she was sure it was Patricia's unit. Carol nodded. Badge 614, she said. It was hers. She told us she didn't say anything back then because she didn't want to lose her pension. That and because she'd heard what happened to another dispatcher who'd raised questions in 82 one day on the schedule reassigned to records the next. Quietly. Permanently. People think corruption is always loud, she said. Most of the time it's quiet. Like dust settling. We left the library with more than we expected. Not proof, but confirmation. Patricia hadn't just walked into something. She'd been sent, directed, on a call that wasn't supposed to be logged. And the one person who could have confirmed it, Sergeant Brewster, was the one who'd signed it out. That was no accident. Mr. Weller kept a copy of Carol's handwritten timeline. Not an affidavit, just notes. She said that was all she'd offer. I don't blame her. By March, we were moving cautiously. Weller started backing up his files twice, one set he kept at his office, the other he split between a storage unit and a safe deposit box under a separate name. Grandma kept her movements small. Groceries in the early morning blinds drawn by dusk. I was still too young to understand the full picture, but I could feel it all around us. It had shifted from mystery to something colder. We weren't just looking for answers anymore. We were navigating something protected, and whoever was behind it had started watching. Then came the break. It started with a banker, a woman named Susan Lively, who used to handle employee accounts for the department's credit union. She called Mr. Weller after hearing his name from a former officer he'd interviewed weeks earlier. Said she'd been reviewing dormant accounts ahead of a system update and came across one that stood out. Opened in late October of '85, a joint account between Alan Brewster and a company that didn't exist on file, Greystone Transport, LLC. There were only 2 deposits in that account, both cash. Both made at night. One was for $4,800. The other days before Patricia disappeared for $12,000 even. No notes, no checks. The withdrawals started 2 months later. Smaller amounts, always under $3,000. Always through third-party ATMs. Weller asked if she'd ever flagged it to internal auditors. She said she had, but that nothing ever came of it. The account stayed open until January of '87. Then everything was closed, liquidated, and the paper trail ended. But she'd kept copies. Old habits. She didn't want the files back, just asked that we didn't use her name if things moved forward. That account was the first time we saw money on the table. Before that, it had just been suspicion, movement, silence. Now it was a figure. A motive. Enough to quiet someone. Enough to clean up. Mr. Weller mapped everything again this time, with financials layered over shift logs and property access. The pieces started fitting. Patricia wasn't just running into dirty officers. She was stepping between them and whatever arrangement they had going, informants, staged arrests, evidence, misplacement, maybe even inside tips on planned busts. The money moved through dummy companies and dissolved LLCs. Short-term real estate rentals. Vanishing funds. And Patricia, with her clean record and habit of documenting inconsistencies, was a problem they couldn't afford to have. Around the same time, we received another letter. This one postmarked out of state. No return address. Inside was a photocopy of a notebook page. Lined paper. Faint writing. A list of badge numbers. Dates. One circled in red ink, November 12th. That was the day after Patricia disappeared. Beside it, a note in shaky script, locker cleared by admin. Files missing. No chain of custody. On the back of the page, someone had written, check internal affairs audit logs. Q4. They knew. We didn't know who sent it. We never would. But it was enough. Weller filed a request with a contact inside the Attorney General's office, a man he'd served with decades earlier. The audit logs weren't public, but with enough pressure and the right language, civil exposure, systemic breach, chain of command negligence, they surfaced. And there it was. Line item 22. Internal inquiry initiated November 14th. Closed November 18th. No findings, no action taken, no follow-up recorded. But someone had known. It was nearly midnight when Weller finished laying all of it out on our dining table, files, receipts, maps, the old copy of the property deed. He looked exhausted. Said he'd submit a formal complaint in the morning, take it outside the department, force it up the ladder. Grandma nodded but didn't say much. Just poured him a cup of coffee and kept her hand resting on the base of the lamp like she was bracing for something. I remember thinking how still the house felt. Not quiet still. The kind of stillness you notice in hospitals and churches where people are waiting for something permanent to happen. Weller stood up to leave around 1 Husru a.m. He paused in the doorway and looked back at us. Said softly, "Whatever they were hiding, I think your daughter got too close. And they ran out of ways to keep her quiet except one." He left with his files in hand. I watched the taillights fade down the street through the crack in the curtain. By morning, the front gate of the vacant lot behind the concrete plant had been cut open, and the inside wall of the warehouse had a new spray-painted message in white block letters. It read, "You're still looking in the wrong place." The message on the warehouse wall stayed up for 3 days before someone painted over it. No press release, no acknowledgement from the city or the department. Just gone. Mr. Weller took a photo the morning after it appeared. He didn't say much when he showed it to us, just nodded like something he'd long suspected had finally spoken out loud. That same day, he submitted a formal complaint to the state's Office of Public Integrity, attaching everything: financial records, shift logs, the dispatch timeline from Carol Hensley, even copies of the notes we'd been sent anonymously. He didn't expect a fast response. He just needed the truth to exist somewhere outside of us. Somewhere official. Somewhere it couldn't be quietly buried again. Grandma mailed her final letter the next week. Not to the department this time, but to the Attorney General's office. It was only 2 pages. She wrote it in the morning while the house was still quiet, then folded it into an envelope without rereading it. I didn't see what it said, but I remember her hands trembling slightly as she pressed the stamp down. She whispered, "She didn't disappear. She was disappeared." and for the first time in months, I didn't ask any questions. The next break didn't come from paper trails or old colleagues. It came from the ground. On April 17th, during a state-funded road widening project just outside the city, a maintenance crew found something embedded beneath the concrete base of a drainage tunnel. At first, they thought it was old construction debris, metal piping, maybe foundation material left over from a previous expansion. But when they cleared it by hand, they realized it wasn't scrap. It was a shape. Compact. Wrapped in deteriorated fabric. What they found was a duffel bag sealed in heavy plastic wedged beneath a structural beam that hadn't been exposed since the overpass was poured in the early 90s. The crew halted work immediately. Local police were called to the scene. News vans arrived within hours. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, my mother's name appeared on the evening news again, but now it was paired with a phrase no one had dared say out loud in years possible: remains recovered. They didn't confirm the identity right away. Forensics took over. We were told through a liaison, never directly, that dental records were being compared and personal items were being cataloged. A ring, a name badge, 2 shell casings, one still lodged in a deteriorated notebook, warped and soaked, but partially intact. Inside, investigators found shorthand notes, abbreviations, and initialisms that didn't mean much to the average eye, but to Mr. Weller, they read like breadcrumbs. One entry had a date October 22, 1985. Next to it, a single line gave Wallace tape. Wouldn't take second copy. Finch pushing for access. Wallace had vanished a year after my mom. No known address, no forwarding records. Just gone. Finch was still alive as far as we knew, living in Florida under a different surname, running a marine supply store. Brewster had died the year before in a single-vehicle accident off Highway 12. The case was ruled closed within a week, but the evidence had finally surfaced, and it wasn't just the items found in the bag. There was also damage to the base of the remains, fractures in the bones that pointed to a struggle defensive wounds, and a bullet trajectory that matched the sidearm recovered in the same bag. The serial number was almost unreadable, but beneath the corrosion, it was still there, Patricia Jameson's service weapon. They didn't give us access to the case file, but someone leaked the forensic summary to Mr. Weller 2 weeks after the discovery. The verdict was clear. Cause of death, gunshot wound. Time of death consistent with the afternoon of her disappearance. Weapon her own. Condition of the bag and rate of decay pointed to burial around the time the overpass was first constructed, which meant someone had access to the site or knowledge of its schedule or both. A construction foreman who'd worked that project came forward after the news broke. He said he remembered being told by a city official at the time to avoid digging through the east drainage line during the final days of foundation prep. Said it was odd, but not something he questioned. He couldn't recall the name of the man who'd given the order, just that he wore a department badge and wasn't from the site crew. Everything started moving after that, quietly but steadily. The Attorney General's office issued subpoenas. Grand jury testimony was scheduled. 2 former officers were indicted, one for obstruction, one for evidence tampering. Neither were charged directly in Patricia's murder, but their connection to Finch and Brewster was enough to open old doors. They denied everything. Said they hadn't spoken to Patricia in years. Claimed ignorance of any missing files or reclassified logs. But investigators had the notebooks now. They had chain of custody documents that had been doctored, time stamps that didn't line up, missing surveillance logs from dispatch rooms, and a copy of a transfer request Patricia had submitted dated 2 weeks before she vanished, requesting reassignment due to conflict of interest and sustained internal pressure. It had been signed, but never processed. The internal report long whispered about, but never confirmed, surfaced in the weeks that followed. Written by a junior investigator in early '86, then shelved. It outlined concerns about department morale, unofficial call routing, and a pattern of off-book property seizures. Patricia's name appeared in the final paragraph, not as a victim, but as a whistleblower. Grandma read that report in silence. She didn't cry. Didn't say I told you so. Just folded the pages neatly and set them on the table like she was placing something to rest. The state held a press conference, brief and sterile. They called it a historic reopening of a cold case, promised reforms, promised closure. But they never used the word cover-up, never addressed how long the truth had been sitting under a highway hidden in concrete and silence. We never got a trial. The only man left who could have answered for what happened to my mother had died a year before her body was found. But the facts were out. Her name was cleared. Her sacrifice finally acknowledged. Still, even with all that, I kept returning to one detail, something small. In the bag they recovered with her remains tucked behind the notebook was a cassette tape. Water-damaged, warped. No label, no case. The crime lab couldn't recover anything from it. Said the magnetic layer had deteriorated. Said it was probably blank. But I still think about that tape. I wonder if that was the last thing she left behind. Not for them, for us. And I wonder if someone somewhere knew exactly what it once contained. There was no ceremony, no formal service, no flag folded over a casket, no procession through town. What we got instead was a quiet box shipped from the state lab marked Remains Released, and a line of paperwork to sign at a county office that used to be a DMV. The clerk didn't say a word as she handed it over. Just slid the envelope forward like she was passing a parking ticket, and that was that. We took it home in silence. Grandma carried the box in her lap the whole way back, both hands gripping it like it might dissolve if she let go. She didn't cry, not in front of me. She just sat there, staring straight ahead, mouth pressed flat as the miles ticked by under the tires and the radio stayed off. That night we placed the box on the kitchen table right where we used to sit every Christmas, every birthday, every late-night coffee when the insomnia wouldn't let her sleep. She asked me to leave it there for a while, said she wasn't ready to take it upstairs. So it stayed for days, weeks actually, covered with a cloth, not forgotten. Just paused. Like everything else had to stop until we figured out what came next. What came next, I wasn't sure. The case wasn't closed, but it wasn't exactly open either. Finch hadn't been located. The Florida address was a dead-end store, closed number, disconnected mail piling up. No forwarding contact. It was like someone had tipped him off, or maybe he'd known all along that this day would come. Maybe he'd been waiting for it. Or maybe he wasn't running. Maybe he was just gone. Either way, no arrest, no trial. Just a cascade of internal resignations, sealed court records, and the same phrase echoing through press releases. Insufficient evidence for prosecution, not exoneration, not justice, just absence. Still, there were other things, pieces that hadn't quite surfaced. One of them came from a name I barely remembered, Gordon Wells. He'd been a rookie officer back in the mid-'80s, briefly assigned to Patricia's shift rotation before transferring out to a different district. Mr. Weller tracked him down, said he'd always seemed uneasy when her name came up. Wells agreed to speak off the record. He wouldn't go on camera, wouldn't sign a statement. But he told Weller something that stuck with me. Said there'd been a night, maybe a week before she vanished, when he'd come back to the precinct late and found Patricia in one of the old interview rooms. Not using it, just sitting there, lights off, tape recorder running. He asked if she needed help, and she told him no, everything was fine. But what struck him was the way she was holding the microphone, not like she was documenting evidence, but like she was confessing something, or recording it for someone else. A message. He didn't hear the tape. Didn't ask what it was. Just remembered the look on her face. And the silence. That tape never turned up. Not in her locker, not in her home, not among the evidence recovered under the overpass. Which meant, if it existed and if it survived, it was somewhere else. That was when I remembered the old storage unit. Not the one with her uniform and books and photo albums. The other one. The one Grandma mentioned once in passing back when I was a kid before I ever knew what it might have meant. Patricia had rented it under her maiden name separate from everything else, paid for in cash. The receipts were in a shoebox in the attic, bundled with grocery lists and handwritten recipes like just another part of life tucked away to be dealt with later. We tracked down the address. It was still there just outside of town past the old freight yard. Half the units rusted shut, the other half gutted and abandoned. The manager on site didn't ask many questions. He checked the logs, saw that the unit hadn't been accessed since 1986, and said if we had a key, he didn't care what we did. We didn't have a key. But Weller brought bolt cutters. The latch popped after 2 tries. Inside it was mostly paper. Binders, notebooks, bankers' boxes filled with department memos, field notes, carbon copy citations. Most of it yellowed and brittle. But near the back, tucked under a rolled-up mat, was a canvas bag with a portable tape recorder inside. The kind that ran on C batteries and smelled faintly of old rubber and dust. It was heavy. The play button was jammed. The battery compartment was corroded. But the cassette inside, it was intact. Label worn down, but still legible. 1019. PJ. No one spoke. Not for a long time. We didn't listen to it right away. Weller took it to an audio preservation specialist in Columbus. Said if it was what we thought it was, we'd only get 1 shot to hear it right. It took 5 days. They had to bake the tape, literally heat it to stabilize the binding before running it through a transfer system that could digitize it without tearing the ribbon. I was there when Weller got the call. He didn't put it on speaker, just nodded, listened, then said, "Okay. Thank you." That was all. The next day, he brought a flash drive to the house. Grandma asked him to play it in the living room. She wanted to hear it in the open. The file started with static, then her voice. Flat at first. Professional. "This is Officer Patricia Jameson, badge number 14762. If you're hearing this, I'm no longer safe." There was a pause and the sound of a door closing. Then her tone changed lower, more direct. She named names. Finch, Brewster, Wallace. She talked about the evidence she'd tried to log and how it kept disappearing. She said she'd made 2 copies, one for the DA, one for herself, but that the first had been intercepted. She said she didn't know who she could trust anymore, that even her own shift partner had started acting strange. Then, finally, she said something I'll never forget. "If they find this, they'll say I made it up. They'll say I was unstable or paranoid. They'll twist whatever they have to. But the truth is simple. I saw what I wasn't supposed to, and I wouldn't let it go." The recording ended with her saying my name, not as a message, just as a memory. Tell her, she was never the reason. She was the light. Then silence. We sat there for a long time after that. No one moved. No one said a word. The sun went down without any of us noticing. The next morning, Weller forwarded the audio file to the Office of Public Integrity. The AG's office reopened the case under new grounds, posthumous whistleblower testimony. It wasn't a conviction. It wasn't even a guarantee. But it was something. A voice undeniable, unedited, and real finally added to the record. Not erased, not redacted. Heard. And still, even now, I don't know what justice looks like for someone like her. But I know what silence feels like. And I know what it cost her to break it. They never did find Finch. Not officially. The last trace was a flagged passport hit in Belize. Then nothing. No extradition, no formal charges. He was quietly retired from the force pension sealed records, restricted under a departmental policy that let certain personnel files remain off limits in the interest of institutional continuity. I don't think they expected anyone to look past that. But people did. Not all at once, just gradually. Some of Patricia's old classmates came forward, names I'd seen in her yearbooks, now gray-haired, unrecognizable but suddenly willing to speak. A few remembered her talking about a case she wasn't supposed to be involved in. One said she'd been asking questions about a missing teenage girl, someone who'd vanished during a traffic stop in 1985. No one could recall the name, and the local blotters had been purged. But the thread was there. Quiet unraveling waiting to be pulled. Weller stayed on the case long after the headlines faded. He didn't chase arrests anymore. He chased context. Retired now, but still sending me clippings files, sometimes just a sentence typed out at the top of an email. Thought this might connect. I think he saw in her what the system never did, a mind that wouldn't let go, and a heart that still believed truth mattered. That belief cost her everything, but it also carved a path for the rest of us. One we're still walking. As for Grandma, she kept the box on the mantel for nearly a year. Then one morning she asked me to take her out to the old lake road where Patricia used to walk after shift changes, where the fog always settled low over the water and the trees kept their distance like they were listening. We scattered her ashes there without music, without speech. Just a single photograph wedged between two stones and the sound of wind moving through the cattails. It was enough. I think about her most when things go quiet. Late at night in the space before sleep when the house feels paused. I used to ask myself what justice would have looked like for her. Now I think it was never about that. Not really. It was about not being erased. About someone saying, I know what happened to her. I heard her voice. I remember. That's what this has become for me. Not a mystery, not a case. A memory preserved, protected, passed forward. If you're listening to this, you're part of that. You kept her name in the light a little longer. And that matters more than you might think. If this story stayed with you, consider sharing it. For Patricia. For the voices that never got to finish their sentence. So no name has to disappear without someone remembering it was ever spoken.